Welcome to week 6. Hope the class is going well as always. I hope you're excited about each week as you arrive at a new set of information to tackle and talk about and write about. I'm sure you're thrilled each week. I'm happy to be here to help you, guide you through this process. I do hope you find value in the course, even if it's cumbersome, laborsome, annoying. Keep wrestling with it. That's the whole point of this course. And I know, even as we tackle this week, I should say, this week may even seem like, what the heck does this have to do with wellness? Let me try to show you why it's very important. This educational revolution, which I've adopted this term, this is not a look, you won't look this up and you find a specific time periods like the Industrial Revolution. But there has been a revolution in education that if education determines how we think about ourselves, and you can hear me say this later, I'm sure, ourselves, right, those around us, our community, government, all those things, education is very important. Very important. It affects all the dimensions of wellness. Okay, so let's dive into it. Okay, now, you may have heard of the classical model of education, classical Western education. Now, it's a little redundant. Classical education is usually saying Western civilization. So when we talk about Western civilization, what the heck are we talking about? You may have heard of Plato, not the stuff you play with the, you can make shapes out of it, but Plato the philosopher, right? So Plato learned from Socrates, Aristotle learned from Plato. So I'm just going to touch on some philosophy here so you can see how important this change has been to the modern view of education. But in the classical model of education, it was formulated on reading broadly, reading the classics, reading some of the ancient, the books from antiquity, and thinking carefully about the ideals that were espoused in those books, like thinking beyond just the story, but what's going on in the story. Using Plato, using narratives. Like if you think about what he was doing, he was thinking through processes by having objections and he'd rebuttal. This is where he learned how to debate in a good way, like not even debate in a formal sense, but how somebody presents an argument and you present a counter argument. When we talk about logic, right? Logic and logical fallacies. This is where that comes from, is reasonable thinking and using reason in order to find the conclusion that is right. This is why we're supposed to debate things, right? One person has an idea, another person another. You debate, and then we can all see that debate and say, I don't think the ideas and the argument of this other one person was as good as the other one, or maybe they have some. They're both right in some context, but their whole system is broken, or whatever the argument is. Okay. Now, in this classic model, then, with reading broadly, thinking broadly, it wasn't vocationally driven. You'll see this when I use the example of Harvard. It was more about developing the person, okay, the person. And part of that development of the person, this is, again, I'm just taking some snippets here of Plato, but he believed in these 4 virtues that were critical towards developing the person, okay? These, you can see the virtues there: prudence, temperance, fortitude, justice. You'll see things like self-control rolled into them, right? Critical thinking, basically, staying with tasks, right? Basically your liberal, what we call liberal society now, respecting others' ideas, right? That's not liberal politically, but this idea of a liberal society where everybody can express their ideas, okay? He also believed in logos, okay? Logos is the reason for everything. And this is where you can already start to see some of the changes. If you think about the French Revolution and the American Revolution, which we talked about earlier, the French Revolution rooted their revolution in democracy, men decided who gets rights and who doesn't, back to Rousseauian thought of the social contract. So in even Plato's view, this is pre-birth of Christianity, his virtues, okay, the reason, let me back up, the American Revolution was rooted in rights given by transcendence, by God, right? Well, Plato believed in a transcendence of some sort, and he said there has to be a reason, right? Why should we behave in a way that would be beneficial for society? Why should we not kill, right? Why should we not do these things, okay? And he believed there had to be a reason for it, right? The logos. Now, as a result, these virtues stemmed out of the logos, stemmed out of, right, something that these virtues had to be anchored to. Think again, like I'm using this as an example, like the American Revolution. Your rights are anchored to a transcendence gave those to you, not they weren't voted on by men, where Rousseau would say, no, they've been men, French Revolution. Well, think about these two words, virtue and values. Well, the values of a culture, they're a lot of times people, we think these are the same thing. They're not. The values of a culture are, again, the kind of think French Revolution, Rousseauian. Those values of a culture can change. That's why one culture can have different values than another culture. Okay, it's the people in that culture that establish the values, and once established, then anybody outside of those values is booted, okay, or ostracized or whatever. All right. Virtue, though, says, well, it's not the culture that decides. Okay, it's not the culture that decides these virtues. It's a transcendence, and that's a big shift because as we look through modernity, again, this highlights this move away from virtues, and move towards values. Okay, and then later, on top of this, kind of this classical education, again, Western's a little redundant, but education is Christianity, right? And Constantine converted to Christianity. He was a Roman emperor, and when that occurred, Christianity, it was already growing, but it exploded at that point on a national level. And you have the start moving into the start of, you had some significant times in history before that, but into Christendom. Okay, so you have this picture here from 1170, 700 years or so after Constantine, that has what St. Thomas Aquinas called the theology was the queen of the sciences. So this is how education used to be viewed: is you see the queen in the middle, and all the other different areas of study revolved around theology. Okay, so there was this kind of, now it would be classical Christian education. This was the prevailing educational system for hundreds and hundreds of years, up until the beginning of the start of the Enlightenment. And it wasn't really even until, we'll see one of the significant players here that comes on the scene, that this changes, right? We move away from this in the 1920s or so and start to move towards more of a, again, we'll see that this changes. We're going to move away from this classical approach, which is more holistic, and move to more of a reductionist approach and gut theology out of it, essentially. And now, you can see the shift in modernity, moving away from more of, think of American Revolution type of structure to more of a French Revolution type of structure. Okay, where virtue is replaced with values, right? Where the transcendence is replaced with demos, the people. Okay, all right. So let's look at the next iteration in education. So hopefully you can kind of see this, though, this classical education. And again, this was the predominant. This is modern education is only 100 years old, really, as what we call modern education. All right, let's look at the next part of this timeline. You're going to read some papers. Read a couple papers. One about the two people on this picture here, John Dewey and Sneeden. And then also just a brief commentary on W. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. I wanted to highlight these men because their influences on education are significant. And I'll explain the little institutional scorecard there on the right too. So John Dewey, in the I would say the early part of the 20th century is probably the best way. He spanned a little bit of time here, but he rejected the classical model. Okay, and this is in the United States predominantly, but you can see the shift throughout the world of the Western culture. And he instead instilled and installed this idea, and so gutted the theology as the center. And you also see around the same time the Scopes monkey trials, like we highlighted that before, in the 1920s, the challenging of, again, you see all these kind of tentacles reaching in of pushing creationism out of the public schools, instead installing a Darwinian view of creation. So this kind of follows along the same path. And John Dewey was certainly not a believer in a transcendence. So his idea was more pragmatic. So he's often said to be the pragmatist, right? And pragmatism. And so this was the okay, let's move away from the classical education. We don't need to think about Aristotle and Plato. We certainly don't need to think about any sort of transcendence, Christianity, any influence of that. And we're going to focus instead on student experiences and skills, and having the student touch and feel the education. So less about this was a common thing. Well, it doesn't make any sense if I say it, because these classes I've had. But the idea that you don't just have somebody up there lecturing you per se, right? And more of a Plato, like the teacher was focus, the center. Where Dewey is a little bit more moved towards doing. The student should be doing more. Okay. His general philosophy, he'll talk about democracy as well. You'll see that in the paper. But you can see a spectrum here from more the classical model to Dewey, who was a progressive thinker. That's what they called themselves then, progressives. And as part of that progressive kind of Marxist approach to moving away from the classical Christian model, is that through this progressive education, this pragmatism, although it was not completely focused on occupational, vocational outcomes like Sneeden, the idea, though, was that the student was to be educated in order to change the system. So that's why I suppose workers change the system. So there was an emphasis on education, but it's a move away from the more transcendence, the more classical model, the more thinking broadly into some of the classical books. I'll give you a personal story. Having understood the classical model now, I went through more of a John Dewey public school type of approach, and maybe you did too. But I see now maybe where the classical, I missed out on a lot of that greater thinking. Okay. Now, that's my opinion. You can push back on that in your writing. Like I always tell you, I'm giving you some facts, and you can do and process them however you wish. I'm not trying to tell you what to think. I'm just giving you some things to think about. So John Dewey is very influential in how we view education today. He was foundational in establishing both teachers' unions. He was a big part of the idea of Common Core, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that reach to John Dewey, and he was kind of the big transition from the classical model. He was a big push of that. He was a clinical psychologist, so just a big move away from the older way of viewing education. Now, you may be asking, what the heck does this have to do with wellness before I go any further? Okay? I don't understand. Like, isn't this a wellness class? Why are we talking about history of education? Who cares? Well, let me ask you, how does your education influence how you think? How does your education influence how you relate to others? Look at the dimensions of wellness, okay? One of the things I'll bring to light as we look at Dewey versus the ancient Greeks and the classical Christian model, what is the outcome with many of the thinking early? Well, the outcome is thinking about things broadly and then reason, logos. If you look at a lot of what we learn today, and I'm part of this too, is it's more about facts, right? Here are some facts. Learn a bunch of facts, regurgitate them on a test. And again, you may think that's the way to go. But the thinking prior to that was, okay, yeah, we need facts, but we also have to learn how to think about facts. It's not just here's a list of facts, memorize them. It's like, well, what about these facts? How do they interact? Right? It's beyond facts. And that was a big shift in Dewey's approach to education as well. W. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington in the African American community, we're having this similar type of debate. It looked a little bit different just because of the topics that were being discussed. And you have some different contexts, of course. Booker T. Washington was born a slave, and I believe he was 9 years old when he was emancipated, right? When the slaves were freed. And his story is phenomenal. I'd encourage you to read it. Up from Slavery is the name of his book, autobiography. It's a wonderful story. But he was a self-made man. I mean, in every way of the word, right? He sought out education. He worked hard. He went through a lot of tribulation, and at the end, he formed the Tuskegee Institute. And his philosophy, though, and I'm skipping out of this hope contract with W. Du Bois a little bit, was, his famous quote, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, is, whatever, drop your bucket where you're at. In other words, wherever you are, just get to work. And that was his philosophy. Remember, he was dealing with a lot of majority of individuals that were coming out of slavery, and so they needed skills immediately to start taking care of their families, take care of themselves, and so vocational training was a part of that. However, he also incorporated your general academic training as well, and so his idea was to educate the masses of freed slaves to get started on practical skills and moving towards your typical academic type of setting. So his approach was everybody should get educated. Contrast with W. Du Bois, who, sorry for all the dinging. I had to stop the video too. There's somebody calling me. I'm popular all of a sudden. That looked at the talented 10th. Okay. And the talented 10th, W. Du Bois was classically educated. So in that Western, just like we talked about the classical Western education, he grew up in the North, which was more integrated. And if you look at the North at this time, pre-Civil War, is that the integration was something we'd all want to achieve today and forever. Is that the color of somebody's skin? Martin Luther King Jr.'s ideals, right? That was being achieved in New England, and the population of African Americans there were small, but everything was integrated. You're talking pre-Civil War. That's pretty incredible, right? That integration occurred. It was because, again, some would argue because of the classical education and being able to realize people aren't valued on their skin color, right? They're valued about who they are, rightly so. So anyway, W. Du Bois, though, believed that it was a elite group of highly educated African Americans that would lead the African American community out of poverty. So you'll read in the paper, right, that hit yourself to a star, as opposed to Booker T. Washington was, hey, let's not have it centralized in an elite 10%. Let's spread it out over the whole population. Let's bring the whole population education level up rather than just focus on a small group. Okay, and you see these two models, and you can look and see which type of approach has been moved forward in education in general. Do we look at only a small group that we try to say these elite thinkers will lead us all into higher education, or hey, everybody should have access to a college degree, and everybody should be promoted towards better thinking, critical thinking, developing the person. So W. Du Bois, part of his was scholars change the system, right? So if these talented 10th would would come about, then they could change the system and then help, then again, in context of the times here, help this specific people group, in this case African Americans, out of getting out of poverty. Okay. Now over the right side here is Sneeden, and I wrote him, workers just work. So unlike Dewey, who wanted to provide some education in the sense of how democracy, just how, I'm going to use the word democracy, not necessarily the political democracy, but just how people can think about Rousseau's social contract, right? People have to agree upon values, not necessarily virtues, but values, and be able to interact with one another. They're going to be occupationally driven, but they're going to interact with one another. They have to be able to be a part of a society, even though it's about values and not virtues anymore. Well, Sneeden was just like, hey, let's just get people to work. Not everybody needs to go to school, right? In the sense of like an education where you're thinking about some of these topics like philosophy and so forth. And so this is where you'll pick up the Dewey-Sneeden debate. So this is kind of on one end of the spectrum. It's now, if you wanted to put this on a spectrum, it'd be like the ancient Greeks, classical education, moving towards modernity. Modernity now guts theology and moves away from this broader thinking and narrows it down now into more of a vocational type of training, pragmatism, right? And now you have an extension of that in the Sneeden, who says, well, let's not even worry about any sort of thinking about society and the social contract. Let's just make workers. Let's just make workers part of a machine. So this is all about facts. This is all about, right, providing education that's very specific. Okay. Now, I put up the scorecard here of local institutions, including OCU. And my question for you is, who won? Who won this debate? So you'll see Dewey Sneeden's argument, right? Debate is, again, Sneeden is just workers need to work, specialized, very specialized, at the expense of any sort of vocational training, at the expense of any sort of like even far removed from classical training. And with Dewey's more of his pragmatism approach, with the focus more on his form of democracy, right? And what he described as democracy is values. Again, back to that values idea. Well, obviously Sneeden won, right? And most scholars acknowledge that. And if you look at our scorecard here of majors, you can see how specialized and how reductionistic our culture has become as a result of thinking modernity. Okay. Now, is that a bad thing? Again, this is for you to decide. Again, holism versus reductionism. Remember back in the lecture when I talked about this, is this a binary choice though? Or perhaps is the real battle over, are we developing the person with a vocation? Okay. So let's look at one other example here. Hopefully you're following. I haven't lost you. One of the challenges, of course, is packing a lot of information history. I'm skipping a lot of things, of course. We could have classes just on this. We can major in this. But I think this is important to frame how we think today, and how we think affects our wellness across all the different dimensions, all of them. Okay. And so this is important to understand the why. This is the root, at least one of them. Sorry, a little bit of indigestion there. So let's look at Harvard's crest. And you're like, what in the world? Like, what are you talking about? I don't care about Harvard. That's fair. Okay. But I think this is an interesting picture of history here. So in Harvard in 1650, Harvard established by the Puritans, landed in the colonies, established in 1636. Real quickly established a university. Okay. And Harvard, this original crest, you'll notice it says Christ on it, right? It was a Puritan university. And 3 books were on there. The top 2 books were open and facing, and the other book was turned backwards upside down. So it was basically not like the other books. And the idea was, and the Puritans who believed that Christ was returning, so a second coming was returning. But a lot of that was pointing to the future, like it was unknown. The future was unknown, okay? And could only be known by Christ, because remember that they're operating out of a classical Christian educational system, okay? Now you get to 1880, there's a lot of history in between here as well, just in Harvard, that where we get to this point. But the word veritas, or truth, is written across all 3 books. All 3 books are open and turned around now. So signifying that there is nothing unknown. Man can know everything, right? So you see this shift, right? You see this shift in thinking, okay? It's even demonstrated by the crest, okay? Now, whether you think that's good or bad is up for you to determine, but I'm just showing you how education has changed even when you look at something like the crest. Now, let's look at a typical day at Harvard to wrap this up. A quick Teddy Roosevelt quote, and I'll wind it down here. So let's look at a typical day just to show you what this kind of classical Christian education, the typical model pre-Enlightenment, that's not fair to say. I would say mid-modernity, if you want to go that way, right? When Dewey's approach to education really took over and took hold. But you can see some of the things that this is from, by the way, from 1643, the New England First Fruits. So they recorded what a typical day at Harvard looked like. Okay, and if you look through here, some of the words you may not be able to fully flesh out, but you can see reading Hebrew. Okay, reading the Bible, Ezra and Daniel. Looking at logic and grammar and right these general broad principles, right? Learning how they would read the classics by the Greeks, right? That's why they learned Greek too, but they would read Greek, and take apart these ideas and wrestle with these ideas. Okay, and from here though, it's like, well, okay, what do they do with this education? Then they would go on to do something else, like what we might call grad school, I guess, right? They would go on and become a doctor, become a lawyer, go in the clergy, whatever it was. But this was the general baccalaureate degree was this type of education. Okay, was this type of, and I mean by this is this classical education approach. In this case, it was classical Christian education, at least at this time. Okay, so a very different idea, right? Again, back to Plato's developing the person, the virtues, and logos, right? Then applying the occupation after, as opposed to starting with the occupation and maybe never getting to those other things that Plato was referring to. All right. So to finish, here's a quote by Teddy Roosevelt. Let's see if you can see some of the things we've been talking about in this quote. He graduated from Harvard and he addressed Harvard. This is when he was addressing Harvard, right? At Harvard, making an address. A great university like this, he's talking about Harvard, has 2 special functions. The first, I had put the red as my highlights, okay? The first is to produce a small number of scholars of the highest rank, a small number of men who, in science and literature and art, will do productive work of the first class. The second is to send out into the world a very large number of men who never could achieve or who ought not to try to achieve such a position in the field of scholarship. So he's not saying everybody needs to be a scholar, right? There's going to be a group that are, okay? But what kind of people is Harvard producing then, predominantly? Okay, let's pick it up here. But whose energies are to be felt in every other form of activity, and who should go out from our doors with the balanced development of body, of mind, and above all, character, which shall fit them to do work both honorable and efficient. Okay? Obviously, Teddy Roosevelt was a believer. He was classically educated. Okay? He didn't go through kind of the Dewey approach to education, and certainly not Sneeden. But he understood that not everybody's going to be a scholar, but those that even don't go on to become scholars, that are going to go do work, lots of work, different kinds of work. The development of who they were, though, was of most importance. Okay, so you can kind of see Teddy Roosevelt's, educational philosophy in this quote, and many regard him as a man that accomplished a great deal. If you read his history of his life, it's impressive. All the things he did, and he didn't live very long either, by our standards. So, incredible life that he took on, and did some great things that, in our modern political world, both sides would say that's a really good thing that he did. So just something to think about is, again, this may not be something that comes to your mind when it comes to wellness, education. That doesn't seem to be a big deal. But if we're talking about how we think about ourselves, the world, those around us, the kind of education we get that produces across all the variety of different parts of dimensions of wellness, education is a huge part of that. And it's changed in the last 100 years. And the ideas from modernity have influenced how it's changed, how education was done for hundreds and hundreds of years before the last 100 years as a product of modernity. So this week, you're going to get a chance to think about and maybe push back, say, I don't think it matters that much. Again, I'm grading you on your response, how well you're responding, like the quality of responses, your arguments, etc., and not your opinion on something, but your opinion should be rooted in a good argument. Okay, I'll see you in the next video.